He walked into Iron Temple Fitness wearing a baggy hoodie and worn-out sneakers that had seen better decades, his hunched shoulders and careful movements marking him as someone whose best years were clearly behind him. The younger guys exchanged glances that mixed amusement with mild annoyance at having their serious training session interrupted by someone who obviously didn't belong in their temple of iron and testosterone. Richard Hayes moved through the gym with the deliberate pace of someone whose 71-year-old body required careful management, but his eyes carried an alertness that suggested more than the casual fitness goals that brought most elderly people to commercial gyms. He'd been coming to Iron Temple for 8 months, ever since his doctor had suggested that resistance training might help with the arthritis that was stealing mobility from joints that had once been capable of extraordinary things. The younger men who dominated the free weight area watched him approach with barely concealed skepticism about what someone his age could accomplish with equipment designed for serious athletes who measured their progress in plates rather than pounds. Their jokes about Medicare coverage for gym memberships and suggestions about senior centers with exercise programs more appropriate for his demographic cut through the air like verbal razors designed to establish territorial boundaries that separated serious lifters from casual visitors. But then Richard pulled off his hoodie, and everything changed. Tattoos told stories that belonged in military history books rather than retirement communities. Each mark represented something these young men had never experienced, places they'd never been, battles they'd never fought, sacrifices they couldn't comprehend. Scars revealed more than muscle ever could, evidence of a body that had been tested in ways these amateur athletes could never imagine. When he started lifting with perfect form and controlled power that made their efforts look amateurish, the room fell silent. This wasn't just an old man exercising. This was a legend from a forgotten war, and suddenly, no one was laughing anymore. Welcome to Silent Salute. Iron Temple Fitness sat in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of San Diego, its industrial aesthetic attracting serious athletes who preferred function over fashion in their pursuit of physical excellence. The gym's reputation had been built on no-nonsense training that attracted military personnel, competitive bodybuilders, and fitness enthusiasts who measured their dedication through weight moved rather than memberships maintained or social media posts that documented workouts for public consumption. The morning crowd was especially intense, arriving before dawn to complete workouts that would prepare them for demanding jobs or competitive events that required peak physical conditioning sustained over extended periods. Personal trainers worked with clients whose goals exceeded normal fitness parameters, while amateur bodybuilders pursued muscle mass and strength gains that demanded systematic programming and unwavering commitment to nutritional protocols that most people couldn't maintain without professional guidance and extraordinary dedication. Richard Hayes had been a reluctant addition to Iron Temple's membership, his doctor's recommendation about resistance training conflicting with his preference for the solitary activities that had replaced the team-based physical training that had once defined his daily routine throughout decades of military service. At 71, he moved with the careful deliberation that arthritis demanded, but his bearing suggested military background that gym staff had noted without investigating further or asking questions that might violate the privacy that many veterans preferred to maintain about experiences that remained personal. The younger members who treated Iron Temple as their personal domain tolerated Richard's presence, while making it clear that his fitness goals were fundamentally different from their serious pursuit of strength and muscle mass that required dedication they assumed he couldn't understand or match given his obvious age and physical limitations. Their conversations often included references to his presence that were loud enough for him to hear, but subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability about their intent to discourage his continued membership. What they didn't know was that Richard Hayes had once been Staff Sergeant Richard Hayes, 75th Ranger Regiment, whose service record included 3 tours in Vietnam and participation in classified operations that had tested human endurance beyond anything these young athletes had imagined during their recreational pursuit of physical conditioning. His body carried the evidence of conflicts they'd studied in history books, but never experienced in ways that had shaped every aspect of his understanding about what true strength meant when survival depended on physical and mental toughness rather than aesthetic appearance. The arthritis that brought Richard to Iron Temple was the result of decades of carrying heavy equipment through hostile territory, sleeping in conditions that exposed his joints to environmental factors that accelerated normal wear, and sustaining injuries during combat operations that had been treated under field conditions where immediate medical care focused on keeping him functional rather than preventing long-term consequences that would affect his mobility decades later. Richard's approach to fitness was different from his younger gym mates because his goals were therapeutic rather than competitive, designed to maintain mobility and manage pain rather than build impressive physiques or achieve personal records that could be celebrated on social media. His workouts were prescribed by doctors who understood combat-related injuries and their long-term effects, focusing on movements that would preserve function rather than maximize strength or muscle mass that served no practical purpose for someone whose physical challenges were medical rather than aesthetic. The hoodie Richard wore served multiple purposes beyond simple warmth during early morning workouts when the gym's industrial heating system hadn't yet brought the space to comfortable temperatures. More importantly, it concealed the roadmap of scars and tattoos that told stories he preferred not to share with young people whose understanding of military service came from movies rather than personal experience with the realities that veterans carried for the rest of their lives. His reluctance to discuss his military background wasn't based on shame or regret about his service, but on recognition that most civilians couldn't understand the experiences that had shaped him, and that attempting to explain would often result in either uncomfortable questions about details he couldn't share or expressions of sympathy that he didn't need, and that missed the point about what military service had meant to his generation. This particular morning had started like dozens of others, with Richard arriving early to avoid the busiest periods when younger members' energy and territorial behavior made the gym environment more challenging for someone whose workout routine required concentration and careful attention to movement patterns that prevented aggravation of old injuries while achieving the therapeutic benefits that his medical team had prescribed. The group that had gathered near the free weight area represented the gym's most serious amateur bodybuilders, young men whose dedication to training was genuine, but whose understanding of physical conditioning had been shaped by internet research and competitive environments that emphasized appearance over functional capability. Their conversations mixed technical discussions about training methodologies with social dynamics that established hierarchies based on lifting performance and physical development that impressed other gym members. Marcus Thompson led the group with the confident authority of someone whose physical development had earned respect from peers who measured worth through visible muscle mass and strength performance that could be quantified through numbers that seemed objective but actually reflected very narrow definitions of fitness that ignored other aspects of physical capability. At 28, Marcus carried himself with the pride of someone who'd never encountered physical challenges that couldn't be overcome through systematic training and nutritional discipline. His followers included Jake Martinez, 25, whose dedication to bodybuilding had become his primary identity after college football had ended without the professional opportunities he'd expected, and Brandon Clark, 23, who was using competitive fitness as motivation for lifestyle changes that had transformed him from an overweight teenager into someone whose physical development impressed people who didn't understand the psychological factors that drove his obsessive attention. To training and nutrition. The conversation that morning had focused on training modifications that would enhance their preparation for amateur bodybuilding competitions where they would be judged according to criteria that emphasized muscle mass, symmetry, and conditioning that required months of systematic preparation and sacrifice that most people wouldn't be willing to make for goals that provided no financial compensation or practical benefits beyond personal satisfaction and social recognition within very limited communities. When Richard approached the weight area where they were training, their initial reaction was the protective territorialism that competitive athletes often displayed toward people whose presence might interfere with their serious pursuit of goals that required concentration and systematic progression through training programs that couldn't be modified to accommodate casual users whose fitness objectives were fundamentally different from their own. Marcus's comment about Medicare coverage for gym memberships was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that allowed him to express hostility while maintaining deniability about his intent to discourage Richard's presence in areas that the group considered their exclusive domain. The laughter that followed reflected group dynamics that reinforced social hierarchies through shared participation in behavior that established boundaries between insiders and outsiders. Jake's suggestion about senior centers was intended to reinforce the message that Richard would be more comfortable in environments designed for people his age, where his fitness goals would be appropriate, and where his presence wouldn't interfere with serious training that required equipment and space that should be reserved for people whose dedication matched the gym's reputation for attracting committed athletes. Brandon's contribution about appropriate exercise programs for elderly people demonstrated his participation in group behavior that he understood was necessary for maintaining his acceptance within the social structure that had become important to his identity. Even though his own background included experiences with being excluded that should have made him more empathetic to others who might face similar treatment. Richard heard their comments, but continued his preparation routine without responding, understanding that some conflicts couldn't be won through verbal engagement and that his presence in their space would either be accepted or rejected based on factors other than anything he might say in his own defense. His military experience had taught him that actions often communicated more effectively than words, particularly in situations where territorial disputes needed to be resolved through demonstration of capability rather than explanation of credentials. The routine he followed was prescribed by his physical therapy team and adapted from military fitness programs that had maintained his conditioning throughout decades of service in units where physical readiness was essential for survival rather than optional for aesthetic goals. His movements were systematic and purposeful, focusing on joint mobility and functional strength that would help him maintain independence as he aged while managing the long-term effects of injuries that were part of the price he'd paid for military service. When Richard finally removed his hoodie to begin his lifting routine, the transformation in the gym's atmosphere was immediate and complete. The tattoos that covered his arms and shoulders weren't decorative choices made for aesthetic reasons, but official unit designations and campaign ribbons that told the story of military service and conflicts that had tested American resolve and capability in ways that current generations had never experienced. The 75th Ranger Regiment scroll on his right shoulder identified him as member of one of the Army's most elite infantry units, whose standards for physical conditioning and mental toughness exceeded normal military requirements, and whose selection process eliminated most candidates before they could complete training that prepared them for missions requiring capabilities that conventional forces couldn't provide. The airborne wings tattooed on his left shoulder indicated completion of training that required willingness to jump from aircraft into hostile territory, where survival depended on individual capability and unit cohesion that had been developed through shared experiences that most people couldn't imagine enduring for any purpose, let alone for the abstract concepts of duty and service that motivated military personnel to accept risks that seemed irrational to civilian observers. The campaign ribbons tattooed around his biceps represented deployments to Southeast Asia during some of the most intense fighting of the Vietnam War, where American military personnel had been tested in ways that revealed character and capability that couldn't be predicted through peacetime training or academic preparation, but that emerged only under conditions where failure meant death for individuals and strategic consequences that affected entire nations. But it was the scars that truly told Richard's story in ways that made his tattoos seem like decorative additions to a body that had been marked by experiences these young men had never imagined. Shrapnel wounds from explosions that had killed friends standing nearby showed as irregular patterns of healed tissue that surgical reconstruction had improved but couldn't completely repair. Surgical scars from field medicine that had saved his life in circumstances where evacuation wasn't possible revealed the kind of medical treatment that focused on immediate survival rather than long-term cosmetic outcomes. The accumulated evidence of a body that had been tested in ways these young athletes had never experienced created cognitive dissonance that forced them to reevaluate their assumptions about age, capability, and what physical conditioning meant when survival had depended on performance under conditions that made their gym workouts seem like recreational activities pursued for entertainment rather than preparation for challenges that could determine life or death outcomes. When Richard began his lifting routine, the technical precision of his movements became obvious to observers who understood proper form and efficient movement patterns that maximized training benefits while minimizing injury risk. Every repetition was executed with textbook perfection that reflected decades of physical training conducted under supervision from instructors whose standards had been developed through actual combat experience rather than academic study of exercise science. His breathing was controlled and systematic, coordinated with movement patterns that demonstrated understanding of how respiratory function affected performance under stress. His positioning was exact, reflecting muscle memory that had been developed through thousands of hours of physical training, where imperfect form could result in injury that compromised mission effectiveness or personal survival in environments where weakness couldn't be tolerated. The weights Richard lifted weren't impressive by Iron Temple standards, but the way he lifted them demonstrated mastery that exceeded anything the younger men had achieved despite their obvious dedication to training and their superior strength numbers that measured raw capability without accounting for technical precision or functional application that made strength useful for purposes beyond impressing other gym members. His pace was deliberate rather than rushed, reflecting understanding that training effectiveness depended on quality rather than quantity, and that systematic progression over time produced better results than dramatic efforts that couldn't be sustained consistently. His focus was complete, suggesting mental discipline that allowed him to concentrate on immediate tasks while ignoring distractions that might interfere with optimal performance. The transformation in the gym's atmosphere reflected the younger men's recognition that they were witnessing something that challenged their assumptions about fitness, age, and what constituted genuine strength as opposed to the cosmetic muscular development that they had been pursuing through training programs that emphasized appearance over functional capability that served practical purposes beyond social recognition. Marcus was the first to approach Richard after his workout, his manner reflecting the kind of respect that competitive athletes showed to obvious expertise even when they didn't fully understand what they were witnessing. His questions about Richard's training background were careful and respectful, suggesting recognition that he was speaking with someone whose experience exceeded his own despite the age difference that had initially seemed like evidence of irrelevance rather than accumulated wisdom. Jake and Brandon followed Marcus's lead, their earlier hostility replaced by curiosity about training methods that had produced capabilities they hadn't encountered despite their years of dedicated training and their familiarity with various approaches to physical conditioning that were popular among serious amateur athletes. Their questions revealed genuine interest in learning from someone whose expertise was obvious even though it didn't fit the patterns they had expected based on age-related stereotypes. The conversation that developed was brief but profound, conducted in the language that athletes used when discussing technical aspects of training while respecting boundaries about personal history that remained private for reasons that didn't need explanation. Richard's responses were helpful without being comprehensive, sharing insights about training principles while maintaining appropriate limits about experiences that had shaped his understanding. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres had been training at Iron Temple for 2 years. Ever since his discharge from active duty with the Marine Corps had left him seeking civilian activities that could replace the structure and challenge that military service had provided throughout his adult life. At 28, he brought military discipline to his civilian fitness routine while using physical training as a way to maintain connections to the standards and values that had defined his military identity. Torres had been observing Richard's workout from across the gym with professional interest that reflected his own military background and his recognition of signs that most civilian athletes wouldn't notice, but that were obvious to anyone who'd experienced military physical training conducted according to standards that emphasized functional capability over aesthetic appearance. When Torres approached Richard during a rest period between sets, his manner reflected the respect that military personnel showed to obvious veterans whose service predated their own and whose experience provided context for understanding what military training was supposed to accomplish beyond the basic fitness requirements that most civilians associated with military physical conditioning. The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language that veterans used when discussing military service, while respecting security requirements and personal privacy that governed such discussions even between people who shared similar backgrounds and understood the significance of experiences that couldn't be fully explained to civilian observers. Richard's responses confirmed Torres's assessment while maintaining appropriate boundaries about details that remained personal. But his acknowledgement of shared understanding created immediate bonds between veterans who recognized each other despite the decades that separated their service periods and the different conflicts that had shaped their respective military experiences. When Torres addressed Richard as legend, His use of the term reflected military culture that reserved such recognition for personnel whose service had achieved mythical status within communities that understood what exceptional performance meant when measured against standards that most people never encountered and that tested human capability under conditions that revealed character in ways that peacetime activities couldn't duplicate. The word carried weight that transformed the gym's atmosphere from casual social interaction to formal recognition of service that deserved acknowledgement from people who understood its significance. Even when specific details had to remain private for reasons that transcended personal preference, to include ongoing security considerations that protected information and methods that remained sensitive decades after original operations had concluded. The impact of Torres's recognition rippled through the gym as other members began to understand that the elderly man they had been dismissing was someone whose background exceeded anything they had imagined, whose physical capabilities reflected training and experience that belonged in military history rather than commercial fitness facilities, and whose presence among them represented an opportunity to learn from expertise that couldn't be purchased or replicated through civilian training programs. Richard accepted the recognition with dignity that reflected his military training and his understanding that Torres's acknowledgement came from genuine respect rather than curiosity about details that would remain private regardless of social pressure or professional interest that might motivate questions he wouldn't answer about experiences that belonged to a different era and different standards of service. The younger men who had been mocking Richard's presence found themselves in the position of having misjudged someone whose capabilities exceeded their own despite appearances that had suggested the opposite, learning that assumptions based on age and physical appearance could be completely wrong when applied to people whose backgrounds included experiences that had shaped them in ways that weren't immediately visible to casual observers. Marcus, Jake, and Brandon approached Richard with obvious embarrassment about their earlier behavior, their apologies reflecting recognition that they had failed to show proper respect to someone whose service had earned consideration that they had been too ignorant and arrogant to provide based on superficial judgments that revealed more about their own limitations than about Richard's capabilities. Richard's response to their apologies was gracious but brief, accepting their recognition of error without dwelling on their mistakes or making them feel worse about behavior that had reflected ignorance rather than malice. His military training had taught him that leadership sometimes required allowing people to learn from their mistakes without punishment that would prevent future growth and development. The gym became a different place after Torres's recognition transformed Richard from unwelcome intruder to respected veteran whose presence was valued rather than tolerated. Young athletes began seeking his guidance about training methods and mental approaches that could improve their performance, while learning from someone whose experience spanned decades of physical conditioning conducted according to standards that exceeded anything available through civilian programs. Richard's willingness to share knowledge reflected his understanding that teaching was a way of honoring the military tradition that had shaped him while contributing to civilian communities that benefited from veterans' expertise, even when they didn't understand the source of capabilities that seemed to exceed normal expectations for physical and mental performance. His workouts became informal demonstrations of training principles that emphasized functional capability over aesthetic appearance, systematic progression over dramatic achievement, and mental discipline over emotional expression that impressed observers without providing practical benefits that could be applied to situations requiring genuine strength rather than visible muscle mass. The respect that Richard earned at Iron Temple reflected broader recognition that veterans brought capabilities to civilian communities that couldn't be replicated through commercial training programs or academic study of physical conditioning, but that had been developed through experiences that tested human limits in ways that revealed potential that most people never discovered about themselves. Richard never sought recognition for his military service or acknowledgement of capabilities that had been developed through experiences most people couldn't understand. But when recognition came from someone who appreciated what his service had meant, it arrived in perfect form from a fellow veteran who understood that some achievements deserved acknowledgement regardless of how much time had passed since they were accomplished. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose quiet strength inspired others without seeking attention? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their example continues to guide you. Hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.